What's going on, y'all? It's Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. Welcome to this episode of FSG's podcast. We have a dynamic topic lined up for y'all today as we explore the electric vehicle industry, the EV revolution, and how this is impacting the larger world of FSG's services and solutions. We've got some analysis here to offer you on the evolution of the industry. But before we dive in, I want to make sure you're heading to our website, fsg.com. Again, fsg.com to learn more about our solutions and services and to tap in to more FSG content. All right, y'all, let's dive in. Without further ado, we're chatting electric vehicles. Again, this electric vehicle revolution, if you want to call it, isn't something that's coming on the horizon, right? It's already here. With it has emerged a new set of challenges for businesses across every industry, right? How do they meet the growing demand for EV charging infrastructure? The big question, right? Do they invest in their own chargers? Do they partner with municipalities? Which option do they go with? What requirements do they actually need to follow? What standards, right, to actually make their environment conducive to EV drivers and consumers out there? So whether it's retail parking lots, whether it's fleet depots, tech campuses, logistic hubs, the pressure is on to electrify, right? And to do it in a smart way. But what does it actually take to implement EV charging at scale, right? What pitfalls should businesses avoid? How can leaders ensure that today's investment doesn't become tomorrow's burden as this technology evolves? How do you future-proof this investment? Right? Well, on this episode of the podcast, we're going to be pulling back the curtain on EV charging strategy, and not just why businesses should care about this strategy, but we're going to be actionable here, right? We're going to offer some ways that businesses can confidently plan, build, and future-proof their EV charging infrastructure, right? We'll keep it general, but we're also going to hone in on some of the specific use cases where EV charging infrastructure is most common already and what we see on the horizon for future developments. So, to help break all of this down, I'm pleased to welcome our guest for the episode of the podcast, Mr. Bernie Erickson. He's CMO Emeritus at FSG. He's a seasoned leader in deploying EV charging solutions across various sectors. So, Mr. Erickson, welcome. How you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Bernie, it's a pleasure. I'm curious, before we jump in, why don't you give us the elevator pitch on your background, your knowledge and experience around EV charging infrastructure, right? What's your lens here as we dive into analysis?
Sure. Well, I've been with FSG for a while and have a long history in the lighting and electrical business. And FSG has been involved in the EV side of the business for over 10 years. We started as a company servicing and installing for Tesla and for a lot of the manufacturers. And a few years back, probably 3 or 4 years, probably closer to 5 now. It's hard to believe how it goes by. But we decided to actively jump in on the EV side, not just implementing for others, but becoming a resource for our customers, supplying and installing and offering turnkey EV solutions. In my role, I have handled the innovation in various fronts, and EV charging fell squarely in that area. So I really started FSG's program as to what we could possibly sell, brands, vetting them out, so on and so forth. And so I've kind of become the thought leader in the space.
So let's bring this trend of EV charging infrastructure deployments down to earth and get a little bit more specific with where we're at today, right? Why is EV charging infrastructure becoming a considerable consideration for businesses today, right? And map out for us the ecosystem at play here. Because when we talk about EV charging infrastructure, there's usually more than one responsible party, right? It's not necessarily just businesses, but businesses do have to do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to investing in this infrastructure. And so I'm curious again if you could just give us that context. What's the ecosystem like today with investments around EV charging infrastructure, and where do businesses fit into that pie?
Well, it's obviously very different depending upon what you call a business, right, and where it fits. You had mentioned earlier that there are different pockets where EV charging lives these days, and certainly, you could define a business as an auto dealer, for example, and the answer is obvious, right? They're selling electric vehicles, they're needing to prep them, sell them. You could talk about multifamily housing, apartment buildings where people want to own and charge their vehicles there. And then you could talk about businesses the way we probably started thinking about that, small businesses or large businesses that serve the public, restaurants, hotels, and their customers, their clientele are wanting to charge their vehicles when they visit, or potentially it's a revenue generating opportunity for some of those businesses. So it really depends kind of on which business you're talking about.
Well, why don't we expand on a few of those then? I mean, considering that the dynamics are so different across sectors, I guess it makes sense why we're needing to have this conversation, right? And offer some clarity. So, without getting into the weeds of every sector, give us that high-level view of the disparities, the differences in variety in EV infrastructure rollouts and the dynamics at play for a few of the key sectors where you're seeing the most energy and the most deployments.
Sure. Well, let's start with a little bit of a baseline. We have level 2 and level 3 chargers, AC and DC chargers, right? Certainly the volume of what we see out there are level 2 AC chargers. Those, are where we started initially, and when I speak specifically about FSG, and the largest quantity, we've installed tens of thousands of those level 2 chargers, and then the DC fast chargers, which are much more expensive and lend themselves to, fleet applications and highways and things like that. When we look at those AC chargers, those level 2s, the niches that we think of and where the application and the infrastructure is important, where people live, right? Multifamily housing, apartments, condominiums, probably one of the busiest sectors for level 2 charging. Oftentimes, if it's a commercial apartment building, sometimes that's a bit of an easier putt, right? Because someone owns that building, they want to make it more attractive for EV charging. They're going to invest. They want to invest, because it's part of their survival of making their apartment complex attractive and competitive to its peers. And then there's condominiums and individual ownerships where it's groups of people. And how do you finance that? And how do you put that together, right? How do you create the infrastructure? Both of those are probably one of the areas where we see the highest level of activity on the AC charging side these days, because you own your own home, you could plug it in at night, but at the end of the day, the most cost effective and the easiest charging to do is to do it at night, right? When you bring your vehicle back. And so there is a strong demand. There's a regulatory demand as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, where new construction is requiring it. But then there's that demand for people that have their condo now, or they live in an apartment and they want to drive an electric vehicle. When we talk specifically in that application about infrastructure, that's the question, right? Is there electrical capacity available? Where do we put these chargers? Where does it make the most sense? How do we limit who uses them? These are all considerations that that we have to think about. When we're planning out what's best for a community, and then who's going to pay for them, right?
That's the big question. And so I'm guessing that looks different across different industries, right? But let's take the retail example, for example. How are you seeing retailers tackle actual rollouts, or I guess more of the planning of the various moving pieces for an investment in electric charging or EV charging infrastructure, right? Are they the ones doing the procurement of potential vendors? Are they the ones coordinating the installation of this onto their, parking lot, let's say? Is this often in tandem with a municipality? Are they having to work, with electrical infrastructure and planning to actually implement this? What does the weight and scope of that even initial question of where do we start, right?
Well, you brought up municipalities more than once, and your local municipality is not going to put an EV charger in front of your business, right? That's not happening. Where municipalities will be involved potentially, that could be in tourist destinations or public areas. We've done some rollouts, city of San Antonio, for example, where we did some public entity locations, and that was funded by a third party. But for the most part, the municipal applications we're seeing are mostly for municipal fleet vehicles at this time. So that local business, they're going to have to figure this out on their own, right? The power is going to come from the local business, and the infrastructure will be installed, and the local business can determine whether they want to monetize it or whether they are offering it as an amenity. That local business, in addition, may be installing it for their own employees, right? So it could be employee charging or could be public charging, but let's talk more about public charging, because that's kind of where the area of interest is. How does it work with the public charging? How do they approach it? And I'll make the distinction between hospitality and everything else, right? When you look at hospitality and hotels, I think that's a separate topic, and we could talk about that after we finish this. But let's talk about in general, right? A bank versus a coffee shop versus a restaurant versus whatever it might be. Well, the way EV charging works, the whole cost effectiveness of an EV charger is based on utilization. If you're going to charge for the electricity coming out, if you want to just have it as an advertising feature, or this is an amenity that I have at my business, it's an expensive amenity. Just to have it as an amenity without it being utilized doesn't make much sense. But where you can utilize it, and the people are going to charge, this is where it can at least fund itself or defray most of its cost, or even become an income generator. And so when local businesses are looking at that, the questions become, well, how many should you put in? Right? How many do you need? Where should you put them? And where is it located relative to where the power is? And that's where we come in and do a site assessment, and try to figure out where's the most cost effective place to put the chargers themselves. If you're cutting across the parking lot and going through 200 feet of asphalt, it's going to cost a whole heck of a lot more than if you can mount something near the electric supply, right, and have a shorter run. And so that's part of a site assessment process that goes across all the different applications that we do. The other thing is, why do you want it for your local business, right? Are you just an altruistic person who wants to put a charger there in case somebody gets lost? No, probably not. It has to make some business sense, right? So a restaurant where you want someone to dwell for a period of time where they're going to be there. A convenience store, unless you're a fueling station where somebody's running in and running out, doesn't make the same kind of sense as a restaurant where somebody could sit down for 2 hours and the charge can be meaningful, particularly on the more cost-effective AC chargers that take an hour or two to make a difference, in what they're affecting your vehicle with. So where you put it, the type of business is definitely a consideration. And that's why we see certain businesses like, restaurants, for example, applying it much more than a bank, right? Or a convenience store, and then other locations like a multifamily or a hotel, looking at it with a whole different, set of desires, right? It's almost a mandatory thing. They have to.
So it sounds like businesses face a multitude of challenges when they're considering the installation of EV chargers. Whether that is, again, the actual requirements that their customers are expecting of them, in terms of charging capacity, getting a good demographic pulse on what kind of demand they'd even have for said chargers. There's considerations about, making sure that the chargers can tap into needed electrical infrastructure. I mean, you name it, right? But I'm curious where you think businesses should start when they decide, okay, I'm going to take on an EV charger project, right? What are some of the first steps you often recommend so that they can get a grasp for all of these moving pieces and lay out a plan of action that's actually achievable and doesn't get so lost in the weeds on decisions that don't need that level of intensity, but does also offer clarity on the things that do need a little bit more focus and strategy?
Well, first step is, for if we're not talking fleets and we're not talking auto dealers and we're talking businesses, squarely we're in the realm of the AC charger, right? And we know what those cost, and we can predict that cost pretty accurately. Where there are subsidies available from local electric utilities, makes the decision much easier for a lot of customers. And so, if someone were to come to us, and we get many calls every day, and say, "I'm interested in EV charging. What should I be looking at? What makes sense?" First thing we look at is what kind of business are they in, right? Does it even make sense for them? Why do they want the EV charger? Sometimes it's because the owner of the business bought an EV, and he's now suddenly got he's been bitten by the bug, and he just thinks it's the best thing ever. But it may not make sense for them to invest. But if it's a business where it's complementary, it makes sense, then we kind of go over, are there any subsidies available? Kind of what could the cost look like? Because we know what the equipment is, but we don't know, what the installation will be, without going out there to take a look at a site, and that costs money. We have to send an electrician out, right? It's not like something you can do with Google Earth or something. You have to send somebody out there, and you got to look at the equipment. So you don't want to waste anyone's time. You want to make sure that it's something that we both think makes sense. Once we see that it does, and we can go out there and take a look at the equipment, and see what's there, we get a feel for what we could put there, right? What do they have in terms of existing power, and what could we put there, and how much would it be defrayed by a rebate? And then the next step is what makes sense to put there. And there are statistics that are out there of how many EV owners are in areas, right, and what the density is, where the closest other EV chargers are, and in many cases we can kind of predict, does it look like this is a good spot right from right out of the box? And then the business owner can often add to that by what really makes sense for what they want to achieve. Hey, we want to draw this type of customer in. That's where the restaurants, or people that are trying to get people to stay a little longer, a shopping mall, right? Where you want people to come in and say, "Oh, I have to, my battery's down. I need to charge my vehicle. What am I going to do while it's charging? I'm going to go shop in the store," right? So it could potentially create business as well. And that's where would look at what really makes sense.
Now, what about one of the simple considerations? The number of chargers and the type of charger, right? You sort of already broke it down there a little bit with level 2, level 3 charging, AC versus DC charging. But are there any other bells and whistles that need consideration? Standard plug types, right? Being able to charge across different vehicles. I know over the last several years, standards on chargers have evolved. And so I'm curious where they're at now and how that influences the number of chargers that businesses should be thinking about investing in and the type, right? How do they tackle that question?
Great question. Well, first off, what brand charger? What's going to be reliable? You mentioned in your little opening statement, you don't want to have a bunch of paperweights. So, how are we going to have something that's going to be sustainable and useful long term? And that was a big part of the journey for FSG. We're a very large company. Many times the last man standing, in the room, people and our customers turn to us and, take value in what we say is a good brand, and we're there to support it as well. So we looked and continue to look at many different brands, look at the reliability, how are the chargers made? Are they truly commercial grade? What are the materials they're made with? Secondly, in the realm of the AC charger, the level 2 chargers, which is where the small businesses squarely sit, there are various amperages, right? And we can look at anything from a 32 amp all the way up to an 80 amp level 2 charger. The consideration partly is due to what power is available, right? What the power that's existing at the site is. There may be a thought that the bigger 80 amp charger might be the better way to go because it'll charge cars quicker, but there is a acceptance rate on the vehicles that limits how much they can take anyway. The bigger Rivians and the F-150s can benefit from those bigger chargers, but the average everyday cars, it's probably better to put in the lower amperage chargers, but more of them, rather than a few of those higher amperage chargers. You could serve more people and a broader audience, right? So we'll look at trying to put the largest of that lower amperage charger in, and with as many as we feel is appropriate based on the need. And we talked about utilization, right? The more these chargers are used, the quicker they pay for themselves or they pay back the investment that you made in them, right? So many times we'll look at a reasonable number to start with. We may run the infrastructure for extras to be added later, but we'll start with, let's say, 4 and put 2 or 4 of those chargers in front of that business. And as we monitor them and see how much they're utilized, maybe that's enough, right? Or maybe we can add additional chargers and expand for more customers. And it goes beyond that. And without getting overly complex, how long does somebody charge for? How much of a charge do they really need? Right? Most people don't run their batteries all the way down. It's not healthy for the vehicle battery, and it's cheapest to charge at home. So a lot of times they want to top off. They want just a little bit of extra. So we might find that we put in 2 chargers, but people are just charging for a short period of time and then remaining connected. We might be able to power share and not have to run any additional power. So that's where having a partner that helps you analyze that, not just in the beginning, but is wedded to your success throughout the duration of using that charger. That's where we come in handy.
You mentioned electrical capacity. Let's expand on that just for a second here. How should companies assess their current electrical capacity and some of the workarounds, right, for making sure that they can actually power these chargers? Like you mentioned, maybe locally, feed power from elsewhere in partnership with another business or property that's located close by, or maybe they need to invest in more infrastructure to actually power the chargers themselves. Walk through that question and workflow for businesses, and how you recommend they actually approach assessing, again, current versus needed electrical capacity.
So it's hard, again, if you're talking about a large hotel where they've got a chief engineer on staff, very different than a restaurant where the owner doesn't have any electrical experience, and likely, in terms of any real detailed assessment, it's going to be difficult for them. One thing that I will mention is that I mentioned, first off, the closer to the panel you are, the better you are, right? Because the farther away you go. And it's always funny because somebody will say, well, why don't you put it back all the way over there? Because that's my reserve spot right in the front. Yeah, well, you could do that, but it may cost you $10,000 or $20,000 more than moving the reserve spot. And people get very sensitive about those kinds of things, right? That they don't want to change things around. But that's a real live dynamic in EV charging, is the closer you are and the less distance you run, the more reasonable it's going to be. Now, when we look at the voltage of a panel, 208, 240 volt AC is what level 2 chargers work on. So if you've got a 240 or a 208 volt panel, and that's something you don't need to be an electrician, but you can go and look at what your panel is, that means that we can power it directly from that panel. If it's a 480 volt panel you're looking at, now we need to add a transformer and another panel. Now the costs start to go up, right? So the fact is, if we've got a 208, 240 volt panel, now we've got to start. Now, your question was, how do I know I have enough power in that panel? You, as a local business, probably are not going to know that. But one thing you could look at is if there is not an open breaker, a circuit breaker spot, the circuit breaker, the handle you turn on and off in your house when your wife plugs in too many, curling iron and a hair dryer at the same time, and it trips a breaker and you got to go down the basement and flip that. Well, if you open your panel and there's no extra breakers in that panel, well, that's not a good sign, right? Because that is showing that panel is maxed out. And if there's not something we can remove, then we're going to need to at least install a sub panel in that situation. Not a deal breaker, but if you find a nice 208, 240 volt panel and there's a couple of spare spots, we're feeling good, right? We're feeling like there's definitely some potential to do that. Now, is there enough power in that panel left to power one or multiple chargers? That's where you probably need us to come in there, take a look at what the equipment is, what's really operating, and maybe put a meter on it to see how much power you're drawing. Maybe look at your electric bill, see what your peak load is versus what that service is located for. You can, as you said, bring another service in or upgrade the service, bring the electric utility in. But again, that starts to add expense.
Oh yeah, a lot of moving pieces there. Definitely raises the bill. Speaking of, right, these investments aren't just because of an altruistic goal of everyone having EV chargers at a parking lot, right? The goal here is investment in infrastructure that reflects what is getting consumers out of, if we're going with a retail business, for example, getting consumers off their couch to the store is one of those considerations that they need to be charging their EV. Does your demographic have a higher adoption rate of electric vehicles? Are you starting to just see them in your region? Great. Let's get some infrastructure there to get those customers to the store and encourage them to stay longer, buy more, better rapport with the brand, right? Really what I'm saying here is ROI is important. Businesses need to have a clear understanding of how this investment is going to benefit the long game here, right? And have a return on said investment. So how should businesses be thinking about their ROI when they're investing in EV chargers, right? And I know it's tough to lay out the same ROI across every industry. So if we want to hone in on just retail or maybe hospitality, as an example, that could be good. But give us some general and maybe some use case specific examples here. Again, how should they be weighing and strategizing around the short and long game for ROI when they invest in EV chargers?
I'll tell you what, let's start with the retail because that's the topic we've been on. And then let's segue. Let's use that as an opportunity to segue to hospitality, right? So with retail, again, you're less looking at it as a way to make revenue and more, as the benefit. It's not like a big money maker. And again, with a level 2 charger, some retailers say, well, maybe I'm by the highway. Right? Maybe I'll attract people to come off the highway and charge there. And while that's not impossible, and certainly if you've got a place for them to spend time, that makes it more possible, right? But we don't delude ourselves to say that people driving down the highways look for level 2 chargers. They want to find a DC fast charger and spend 30 minutes charging, not 2 hours, 3 hours, making a substantial bump. So really, when you're looking at this as a business, you want to bring people to your store and you want them to be able to top off or add some range. And so for them, what makes the most sense is putting in a couple of chargers. Even if you look at a lot of these rebate programs that the utilities will substantially contribute to the make-ready costs, a lot of times they'll limit it to 4, and say, start out with the 4. Let's see what's going. I'd rather put 4 here and 4 here and 4 here, And so how can you determine with those 4 how long it takes for you to get your money back? Well, when you're charging customers, you have a cost for the electricity. You've got to buy that kilowatt hour of energy from the electric utility. So let's say you're in an area where that kilowatt hour costs 20 cents. What can you sell it for, right? Well, part of that, if you're in an area where you have competition for EV charging, is based on what the market is charging. But more often than not, if people want that convenience and they found your charger, they're not going to leave for a nickel. So, there's kind of a norm, let's say 35 to 40 cents a kilowatt hour that's being charged across the country. And that's your profit, right? That's going to be the profit that you make on your electricity. And then there's perhaps a charging session fee that you can charge. And this is all in the software. You can set this up. And let's just say that's $1 an hour that you charge as a session fee. Well, we have a calculator that you can use. It's on our website that lets you plug in your assumptions. Nationally, what do these level 2 chargers see in terms of utilization? Because I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish I could tell people this is exactly what you're going to see. And that's often what people ask us. Tell me, how much charging am I going to get? I have no idea. You have no idea. If there's no other chargers around and you put these in there, that there may be a line, for your charger. Yet we all drive past chargers where we see them sitting empty. And why is that, right? And there's a lot of education going on right now, but the national average is about 4 hours a day, right? And so we can be conservative. If you're more risk averse, we could use this calculator and say you're paying 15, you're going to charge 40. We're going to figure 2 hours a day. For charging an $1 session fee. What would be your payback in that scenario? How long would it take you to recover your money? Oh, wait, you've got a rebate, that's coming back on the make ready. So your outlay is going to be much shorter. And I think people are surprised to see how quickly they can recover that money. There is this ability to test drive it by putting 2 instead of 4, right? And lowering your risk and then adding those later. And so that's kind of how people can get that feel. Now let's segue over to hospitality and hotels. Now you got a completely different story, right? Here is a situation where people who drive electric cars, they definitely have to charge at night. And if a competing hotel offers EV charging and your hotel does not, now you're at a disadvantage to the competition. And it's funny because many hotels get into that situation where they're somewhat jaded from the early Tesla days, right? And you asked a question before, and I didn't answer it, about what about the plugs and are they universal, right? And for the most part, there are adapters and any charger can do any car. People that drive a Tesla have a different plug than the rest of the world right now, right? The J172, which is on all the American vehicles and everything else, different than the Tesla connector. And everybody's going to a new NACS connector. That's where the whole industry is going. But I wouldn't worry about that, right? What we're selling you works. And if you need an adapter on it, that'll be available and cords will be able to be changed. But early on, Tesla's model was to get chargers out there for their network. And they included charging with their cars. You got free charging on their network, and they went out and gave chargers away for free to hotels and to certain types of businesses. And many hotels love that idea. They didn't get any revenue for the charging. Tesla kept the revenue. And they felt, why do I want to be in the EV charging business? And how am I going to make any money doing this? But Tesla really doesn't offer that anymore. And there are a few people that Blink offered it for a while. There are still some people that'll offer that. But what our calculator helps these hotels figure out is, man, be careful what you sign up for, because you're giving up a lot, right? You could put in 2 or 4 chargers and you're going to sign an agreement. You don't have to pay anything up front. You pay a small fee to have it at your facility, but you may be giving up $50,000, $60,000 of income, net income, beyond paying for that equipment over the life of that contract. And you're locked into that contract. You can't go anywhere else. So, for hotels and motels and people that really feel they have to get into that business, how do they approach it? How can they make it cost effective? And how can they still understand that? So our calculator, our analysis helps them understand the cash flow. And then we've got programs where we can lease that equipment to them, or even do a service contract where we will own and maintain the equipment on an agreement over a period of time with them, but they keep the revenue, right? And then they just make a payment on that equipment. And so different ways to approach it. And small businesses can use that same as well.
So now I want to pivot and get some of your quick thoughts on actually running the EV chargers. There's side one, which is investing in them, building them out, getting them implemented. And then there's operationally maintaining uptime and reliability and gauging their use, building strategies around the data you get off of that use to actually make them worth the ROI. So that's the second half of the equation here, right? Let's start with uptime, right? Just maintenance and reliability around these chargers so that they can serve their intended purpose for the business. What are some of the strategies you see out there for companies to ensure uptime and reliability? Do they work with a third-party service for maintenance and checks and upgrades for the chargers? Is there anything they can be doing proactively to ensure that they remain up and reliable when needed during peak business hours? What are some of the basic approaches you're seeing at play here that you've seen work best?
That's one of the big topics of discussion is uptime. How many people do you know, if you talk to them that own electric vehicles, that they'll open up their apps like PlugShare or the ChargePoint app or whatever it might be, and they're looking at chargers, but they see this one's offline, that one's offline, right? They go and they drive to a charger, and there's nothing more disappointing than being low on power in your vehicle and driving to what you thought was an operational charger and finding that it's not operational at all, right? And that's where the whole range anxiety has been building in certain people, and they're afraid to make the jump. So once you have that charger, there's software that's on that charger, right? It communicates to the cloud, and that software package is very important, that it's reliable, and it provides that information, that analysis, but also that clean experience of being able to make sure that if there is a glitch, if the charger needs to be restarted, if there's that can happen. And so a lot of product has been sold already, and there has been a lot of churn in the industry, and it's been hard to pick a player, right? There are players that have gone out of business, that have opened and closed, and people have been stranded with equipment that they can't support. There are software providers that have become non-responsive or are more difficult to deal with. And conceptually, when these chargers are in, the business wants nothing to do with them, right? That's what you as a business owner, that's where you want to end up. You don't want to be having someone walk into your store and say, I'm trying to charge my vehicle and it's not connecting, or it won't take my credit card, or I get an error message or whatever, right? And so that's not where anyone wants to be. So there's signage that goes with these chargers, and the software companies that you contract with become that company, right? That takes the call, that when that person is not able to start a charging session, they dial that 800 number and someone is able to restart the charger. I mean, you all have phones, right? We all have computers. How many times do we still have to restart them? That's the nature of electronic devices. And EV chargers are no different. Every once in a while, they need to be rebooted. A software upgrade didn't go through, and those devices have to connect to the internet, either via cellular or Wi-Fi, right? Which can go down. So, that number one, choosing not only the right hardware, which we talked about earlier, but the right software provider. That's one part of it, right? You need to have a good, strong partner in there that is going to be. And sometimes you'd say, well, is it the biggest company? Is it, the company that? And it's been a tough game out there. Enel, for example, I'll take one customer owned by the electric utility of Italy. So everyone's saying, oh, an electric utility. Well, I'm going to buy my chargers from them, right? Because an electric utility isn't going out of business, and they didn't go out of business. They just stopped supporting and selling their EV chargers in the United States last year. Wow, that's a problem, right? They turned them off, and then the government got involved, and someone stepped up to do it. So it's still the wild, wild west out there. And so picking a strong partner and an implementer that's going to stand by that partner is important. Maintenance. You talked about maintenance, and what if somebody rips the cable off, or what if a part is defective, or whatever. We really recommend taking that warranty and taking it for at least 5 years, which is what many of the manufacturers will offer up to, and ideally a material and labor warranty, so that if that charger goes down, that at worst it's a phone call to get the warranty service that you need, to make sure that it's up and running quickly. And when you talk about uptime warranties now, or response times, those, those are all things you could look at, and the lowest first cost is often, as with the case of so many things, not the lowest long-term cost, right? You buy a warranty without a labor warranty and with no performance parameters to it, and you could be waiting 3 months for a part and then finding somebody to put it in, or if you have a labor warranty but they don't show up for 2 months, right? These are all very genuine concerns. And so with all the major brands, at least most of them, you can opt in for that uptime warranty. Many of them will warrant 98, 99% uptime, and response time, 2-hour response time to get a call back, or 1 day to come and do a repair. These are all things that you can look at that are optional, that you can purchase. But I will state one thing: what's the uptime warranty? What's the repercussion? Right? You have a 98% uptime warranty, and what happens? They pay you back for the energy you didn't get to sell. No, that's not how it works. They give you back your software costs and the additional fee you paid. But at least there's something, right? At least there's something that shows that the manufacturer or the reseller has skin in the game with you.
All right, Bernie, to wrap things up, I want to pivot to one more use case that I think fits in neatly with the conversation we've been having today. We've been using retail and hospitality as two similar industries, you could say, or verticals, which share similar strategies and considerations for EV charging infrastructure deployment. The other that is its own beast, but does have similar considerations, especially because it's focused on level 2 charging, is multifamily installation, right? Getting EV chargers for your multifamily environments. Apartment complexes, for example. I'm curious where you see deployment strategies, ROI strategies, the basic considerations to be similar right, when looking at retail hospitality versus multifamily, and where you see those considerations and strategies look a little different. Give us your pulse check on that use case and what kind of learning lessons we can take away from how they're approaching EV charging infrastructure deployment.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, multifamily, as we said, people want to charge where they live, right? They want to charge at night. That's the most economical thing. They're not running around and hunting, for charging somewhere. And it can take different shapes. Current codes and regulations, it's mandatory that these new, facilities that are going up have EV charging. But a apartment or a condo, it's a lot easier to ascertain what the what the usage is going to be just based on the number of people in facilities that own EVs now. If you poll your condo association, if 20% of the people have EVs, you could feel pretty good that those 20% of the people are going to use them every night to charge their vehicles. It's unlikely they wouldn't want to. And so our utilization times are pretty predictable. We go and visit a facility like that, more often than not, they want more than maybe they can have initially, like from first blush. You look at that and they say, well, man, give us 20 EV chargers, right? A lot different than the commercial business. We might say 4 is enough to bring in the customers that are going to be transient and going through there. But in a multifamily, they're going to want more. Maybe they'll start with fewer, but they're surely going to want more as time progresses. And geographically, that may vary, depending upon what part of the country you're in. But just about everywhere, there are EVs deployed. So here's an application where we get into utilizing power sharing of EV charging a lot more than we do in a commercial business, for example. And what is power sharing? Power sharing is when you can put, you have a 48 amp charger that needs a 60 amp circuit breaker. You typically in a commercial business want to give that customer the full 48 amps when they're charging, which will give them maybe 30, 40 miles of range for every hour they're plugged in, so that they can get a meaningful charge while they're having their dinner or they're shopping. But we have the ability with EV chargers to power share, where we put 2 chargers on a 60 amp breaker or 3 chargers. And if 3 people plug in, each person gets a third of the power that's available. And then if 2 people plug in, they get half. And even if 3 people are plugged in, if the first 2 finish up, the third one then gets the full charge. Well, we might not want to do that in a restaurant, but it makes a heck of a lot of sense in multifamily because everyone is going to be there plugged in all night long. They get home from work, they plug in their vehicle. So we might be able to share that power. And okay, maybe they're only going to get 20%, but they're plugged in for 8, 10 hours, and they're going to get a meaningful charge by the morning. So when we do those site assessments for multifamily or even apartments, we'll look at what is the capacity available, and then we may use the ability to power share right out of the box, or maybe we put enough chargers to accommodate for today, but then we can add to them with power sharing in the future without having to have any disruption of running additional wiring, right? Maybe just mounting a second charger on a pedestal. So it's a bit of a different, different approach. Another thing to mention is that in many areas where we have rebates and utility subsidies, there are additional subsidies in the multifamily areas, right? So it makes it even more cost effective. That might not apply to a small business, but it's definitely going to apply to a multifamily. And then 1/3 layer, if that multifamily is in a disadvantaged area, right? It may have a 3rd layer of subsidy. So here you may have an apartment building in a very urban disadvantaged area, and you're thinking, I'm not going to be able to do something there. And actually, you may be highly subsidized where it won't come out at all. Last comment on it is you now decide what are you going to charge for that power. And you can charge 40 cents a kilowatt hour to the members of a homeowners association to recover the cost, right? Or in an apartment complex, you may let certain people have a dedicated spot and charge for free and make that as a amenity on a high-end luxury apartment. So there's lots of different ways that we can approach it in that multifamily arena.
And I think that flexibility of approach is something that businesses should keep in mind. There's not one stiff playbook for deploying EV chargers that you then need to adapt to and flex your entire operation and investment strategy around, right? EV chargers are meant to be an operational bonus, right? Are meant to be a hook to bring more, if we're talking retail or hospitality, to bring more, potential consumers to your store. If we're talking multifamily, they're meant to be something that elevates the experience of day-to-day living for your tenants, right? And so that being the goal, rather than I need to deploy EV chargers, but rather what solution are you trying to actually solve for? What experience are you hoping to add to your customer base, your consumer base, your tenants, right? That should be the driving force. And once that's the driving force, the strategy for deploying and all the bells and whistles and the different roads you can take start to become a little bit more clear, and you can adapt those to your specific business barriers, right? Whether that's budget barriers or operational ones, and your goals as well. So love that as sort of a final note here for our audience. Bernie, thank you so much for your analysis today. This has been really insightful. Hopefully businesses watching along feel that they have a better pulse on electric vehicle charging infrastructure, strategies for deployment, and just more generally where this movement is at and how you as a business should be thinking through these strategic investments. Again, folks, we've been chatting with CMO Emeritus at FSG, Mr. Bernie Erickson. Bernie, if folks want to tap into your insights a little bit more, your wealth of experience, how can they get in touch?
You can visit our page, on EV charging, has a contact sheet there and some really useful articles as well, on how you can approach it, how a site assessment is conducted, how financing works, fsg.com/EV-charging. A great resource, and you can contact me through there as well.
Fantastic stuff. All right. Thank you so much, Bernie. Again, we've been chatting with Bernie Erickson, CMO Emeritus at FSG. Bernie, looking forward to our next conversation.
Same here. Take care.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of FSG's podcast. Again, if you like what you heard and saw, and you want to tap into previous or future episodes of the show, depending on when you're listening to this episode, or if you just want to learn more about the topic at hand here and how FSG can support your EV charging infrastructure journey, head to our website, fsg.com. You can also head to the specific EV charging page, fsg.com/EV-charging. I'll hit that one more time, fsg.com/EV-charging. Go ahead and check that page out for more solutions, services, thought leadership, and guidance to get a better pulse on the industry. And we're looking forward to seeing you on the next episode of the show. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. We'll catch you on the next episode of FSG's podcast.